The first thing Ethan noticed about Daniel was that he never smiled. Not when the other instructors joked around the campfire. Not when someone successfully completed a difficult climbing exercise. Not even when the entire group celebrated their first morning on the mountain with hot coffee and terrible powdered eggs. Daniel simply stood there, arms folded across his chest, watching everything with a quiet seriousness. Ethan had arrived in Colorado 3 days earlier, carrying one backpack, a pair of worn hiking boots, and more uncertainty than he wanted to admit. At 24, he had spent most of his life in cities. He knew how to navigate crowded streets, work long hours, and pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. But the wilderness was different. Out here, there were no distractions. No traffic. No office buildings. No familiar faces. Only mountains. And apparently, Daniel. The private wilderness leadership program was supposed to help Ethan rebuild his confidence. After months of feeling stuck in his life, he had decided he needed something completely different. The program promised outdoor leadership training, survival skills, hiking, climbing, and personal development. He hadn't expected his mentor to look like someone who had been carved out of stone. Daniel was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beginning to show a few strands of gray. He usually wore a faded green jacket, hiking boots, and a simple watch. There was nothing flashy about him. Yet everyone respected him. The younger instructors listened when he spoke. The participants trusted his decisions. Even the most nervous hikers seemed to calm down whenever Daniel was nearby. Ethan couldn't understand why. Daniel barely said anything. "You're Ethan?" Ethan looked up. Daniel was standing in front of him. "Yeah." Daniel glanced at the backpack beside Ethan. "How much does that weigh?" Ethan blinked. I don't know." "Too much." Ethan looked down at it. "I thought I packed light." "You packed like you're moving into the mountains." For a moment, Ethan wasn't sure whether Daniel was joking. Then he noticed the faintest change in Daniel's expression. Not a smile. Almost a smile. Ethan couldn't help laughing. "So that's your version of a welcome." Daniel picked up the backpack and handed it back. "It's my version of saving you from carrying unnecessary weight." Then he walked away. Ethan watched him go. There was something strange about the man. Something Ethan couldn't explain. Over the next several days, Daniel became responsible for Ethan's training group. He taught them how to read a trail map, recognize changing weather patterns, build emergency shelters, and move safely across steep terrain. He was demanding. Again. Ethan had just completed a rope exercise when Daniel pointed toward the equipment. "I already did it." "Your knot was loose." "It held." "That's not the standard." Ethan sighed. Daniel waited. There was no anger in his voice. No insult. Just patience. Ethan redid the knot. Daniel checked it. Better. That single word somehow felt like an award. By the end of the week, Ethan had learned that Daniel noticed everything. If someone forgot water, Daniel noticed. If someone's boots weren't tied properly, Daniel noticed. If a participant looked exhausted, Daniel noticed. And, for reasons Ethan didn't understand, Daniel always seemed to notice Ethan first. During one afternoon hike, the group climbed higher into the mountains. The air became colder, and the trail narrowed between rocky slopes. Ethan tried to keep up with the others, but his breathing became heavier. He didn't want anyone to notice. Especially Daniel. So he kept walking. 10 minutes later, Daniel slowed down beside him. "You okay?" "I'm fine." Daniel looked at him. "You've said that 3 times. Ethan smiled awkwardly. "Maybe I really am fine." Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he quietly adjusted the pace of the entire group. 5-minute break. Everyone stopped. Ethan looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." Daniel opened his water bottle. "I know." That answer stayed with Ethan. Daniel hadn't embarrassed him. He hadn't announced that Ethan was struggling. He had simply helped without making him feel weak. That evening, everyone gathered around the campfire. The sky was clear enough to reveal thousands of stars. Ethan sat slightly away from the group, listening to the others talk. Daniel was on the other side of the fire. Someone asked him where he had learned all his wilderness skills. Daniel stared into the flames. A long time ago. Military? Someone asked. Daniel shook his head. Private rescue work. How long? Long enough. The conversation moved on. Ethan noticed that Daniel's expression had changed. For the first time, the man looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stepped outside his cabin and walked toward the edge of the clearing. The mountains were dark silhouettes beneath the moon. He heard footsteps behind him. Daniel, you should be sleeping. I could say the same thing. Daniel stopped beside him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was strangely peaceful. You like the mountains? Daniel finally asked. Ethan looked toward the peaks. I think I'm starting to. Why? Ethan thought about it. Because nobody expects anything from you out here. Daniel turned slightly toward him. Ethan continued. In the city, everyone is always asking what you're doing next. What job you want. Where you're going. Whether you're successful. He laughed quietly. Out here, nobody cares. You're just trying to make it to the top of a mountain. Daniel looked at the distant peaks. That's sometimes enough. Ethan glanced at him. Do you ever miss the city? No. The answer came immediately. Why? Daniel was quiet. Too many memories. Ethan wanted to ask what memories. But something in Daniel's expression stopped him. So instead he said, You know, you're not as intimidating as I thought. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's unfortunate. Ethan laughed. And this time, Daniel actually smiled. It lasted only a second. But Ethan saw it. And somehow, that tiny smile felt more meaningful than anything Daniel had said all week. The following morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. When he stepped outside, he found a thermos sitting on a wooden bench. There was a small note attached. For the early riser. No name. Ethan didn't need one. He looked toward the main cabin. Daniel was standing by the doorway, checking equipment. Their eyes met. Daniel gave him a small nod. Ethan smiled. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, the mountains didn't feel completely unfamiliar. And for reasons Ethan couldn't yet explain, neither did Daniel. Something had begun between them. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was simply a quiet connection, built from small gestures, long silences, and moments neither man was ready to name. But sometimes, Ethan would later realize, the most important stories don't begin with a confession. They begin with a person who quietly notices when you're struggling and stays beside you without asking you to explain why. The mountains had looked peaceful that morning. Too peaceful. Ethan noticed it as soon as he stepped outside the lodge. The sky was pale blue, the air was cold and clean, and sunlight spilled across the snow-covered peaks. A few thin clouds floated above the Rocky Mountains, but nothing about the morning seemed unusual. Daniel stood near the vehicles, checking equipment. Everyone ready? The group answered almost together. Ethan adjusted his backpack and looked toward Daniel. After the previous week, something between them had changed. It wasn't obvious. Daniel was still his reserved, disciplined mentor. Ethan was still the young participant trying to prove himself. But now there was a quiet understanding between them. Sometimes Daniel would look at Ethan from across the group. Sometimes Ethan would catch himself waiting for Daniel's approval. And sometimes, when nobody was watching, Daniel would give him that brief, almost smile. They began their weekend trip deeper into the Rocky Mountains. The plan was simple: hike several miles into a remote area, spend the afternoon practicing navigation and survival skills, then stay overnight at a small emergency cabin before returning the following day. Daniel had made the route many times. He knew the mountains. He knew the weather. At least he thought he did. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. Ethan noticed the first snowflakes while they were crossing a narrow trail. Daniel? Daniel stopped. What? Ethan pointed toward the sky. Snow was beginning to fall. Daniel looked upward. His expression immediately changed. Everyone stopped. The group gathered around him. Daniel pulled out his weather radio. Static filled the air. Then a broken voice came through. A winter storm was moving into the area much faster than expected. Visibility was expected to become dangerous within the hour. Daniel looked toward the trail ahead. We're not making it back tonight. One of the participants looked nervous. What do we do? Daniel didn't hesitate. We go to the emergency cabin. The group moved quickly. The snow became heavier. Within 20 minutes, the trail had almost disappeared. Wind rushed between the trees. Ethan struggled to see more than a few yards ahead. Daniel stayed near the back of the group, making sure nobody was left behind. Ethan turned. Daniel was beside him. Stay close. I am. Closer. Ethan nodded. They continued through the storm. The cabin finally appeared between the trees just as daylight began to disappear. It was small, old, and almost completely covered in snow. But it was shelter. Daniel unlocked the door. Everyone inside. The group hurried through the doorway. The cabin had enough space for everyone to sit comfortably, but not much else. There was a fireplace, several blankets, a small kitchen area, and an emergency radio. Daniel checked the radio. Nothing. No signal. No outside communication. The storm had cut them off. We're staying here tonight, Daniel announced. Nobody argued. Hours passed. The storm became louder. Snow struck the windows like tiny pieces of gravel. The group eventually settled into sleeping bags around the cabin. Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat near the fireplace, watching the flames. Daniel was sitting across from him. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, "You should rest." "I'm not tired." Daniel looked at him. "You've been staring at that fire for 20 minutes. Ethan smiled. "Maybe it's interesting." "It's fire." "Still interesting." Daniel's mouth curved slightly. There it was again. That almost smile. Ethan leaned back. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "Why don't you ever talk about yourself?" Daniel looked into the fire. "There's not much to talk about." "I don't believe that." "Why?" "Because people who say that usually have the most to talk about." Daniel was silent. Outside, the storm continued. Finally, he said, "I used to have someone." Ethan's expression changed. "Someone?" "A partner." Daniel's voice was quiet. Ethan didn't interrupt. "We were together for several years." "What happened?" Daniel stared at the flames. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Being honest." Ethan waited. Daniel continued. "I cared about him more than I knew how to explain. But I kept thinking there would always be more time." He swallowed. "There wasn't." The fire cracked softly. Ethan looked down. "I'm sorry." Daniel nodded. "I lost him because I kept everything inside." "Did he leave?" "Eventually." Daniel gave a small, painful smile. He got tired of loving someone who couldn't tell him what he felt. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. "Did you love him?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Yes." The answer was immediate. "Very much." The silence that followed felt different. Ethan suddenly understood Daniel in a way he hadn't before. The silence. The distance. The discipline. The walls. They weren't because Daniel didn't feel anything. They were because he felt too much. "Do you still think about him?" Ethan asked. "Sometimes." "Do you regret it?" Daniel looked back at the fire. "Every day." Ethan didn't know what to say. So he simply remained there. Beside him. Daniel looked at Ethan. "You don't have to stay." "I know." "Then why are you staying?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Because you shouldn't have to talk about something painful and then sit alone afterward." Daniel's expression softened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he quietly replied, "Thank you." Ethan smiled. The storm continued outside, but inside the cabin, everything felt strangely calm. They talked for hours. About childhood. About dreams. About mistakes. About the people they had lost. Ethan told Daniel that he had spent years trying to become the person everyone expected him to be. Daniel listened without interrupting. Then Ethan asked, "What do you want now?" Daniel looked at him. The question seemed to surprise him. "I don't know." "That's okay." Daniel nodded. "I think I want to stop being afraid." Ethan's heart beat faster. "Afraid of what?" Daniel looked toward the window. "Of letting someone get close." Their eyes met. Neither looked away. For one quiet moment, the distance between them seemed to disappear. Ethan could hear the storm outside. He could hear the fire. And he could hear his own heartbeat. Daniel finally broke eye contact. "You should sleep." Ethan smiled softly. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Ethan." Ethan walked toward his sleeping bag. Before closing his eyes, he looked back. Daniel was still sitting beside the fireplace. But something about him was different. The walls had come down, if only for one night. And Ethan realized something he hadn't expected. Daniel wasn't cold. He wasn't emotionless. He wasn't incapable of love. He was simply a man who had once loved deeply, lost painfully, and spent years protecting himself from ever feeling that vulnerable again. Outside, the snowstorm continued to bury the mountains. Inside the small cabin, two hearts had quietly moved closer. Neither of them knew what would happen when morning came. But neither would forget that night. The storm showed no sign of stopping. Snow continued to fall against the cabin windows, covering the mountains in a thick white silence. Inside, the fire had burned lower, casting a warm glow across the wooden walls. Most of the group was asleep, but Ethan was still awake. So was Daniel. Ethan sat near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket, while Daniel quietly added another piece of wood to the fire. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The silence between them no longer felt awkward. It felt intimate. Ethan finally broke it. "Daniel?" "Yeah. Can I tell you something?" Daniel looked at him. "Of course." Ethan took a slow breath. "I think I've been afraid of love for most of my life." Daniel sat down across from him. "Why?" Ethan stared into the fire. "Because I've always felt like people were going to leave." Daniel didn't interrupt. "When I was younger, I watched people around me fall in love, get hurt, and pretend they were okay. I thought the safest thing was never to care too much." He gave a nervous laugh. "Turns out that doesn't really work." Daniel smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." Ethan looked at him. "What about you?" Daniel was quiet. "I told you about my past." "You did. But you didn't tell me everything." Daniel lowered his eyes. "You're right." The fire crackled. Daniel leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "When I lost the person I loved, I convinced myself that being alone was easier." Ethan listened carefully. "I became good at it," Daniel continued. "Work, mountains, training, routine. I filled every part of my life so there would be no empty space." "And did it work?" Daniel looked at him. "For a while." "And now?" Daniel's expression softened. "Now I'm not so sure." Ethan felt his heart beat faster. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan quietly asked, "Why?" Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "Because you came into my life." The words were simple, but they changed the atmosphere inside the cabin. Ethan looked down at his hands. "Daniel, I know." Daniel's voice was gentle. "I know what you're thinking." "What am I thinking?" "That I'm saying something I shouldn't." Ethan looked back at him. "Are you?" Daniel took a breath. "You're important to me." Ethan's eyes softened. "But I'm still your mentor," Daniel continued. "And that matters." The honesty in his voice made Ethan's chest tighten. "I don't want to take advantage of your trust. I don't want you to ever wonder whether my position influenced how you felt about me." Ethan nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." Daniel looked toward the fire. "I've spent years regretting the times I wasn't honest about my feelings." He paused. "But honesty doesn't mean acting without thinking." Ethan smiled gently. "That's probably the most Daniel thing you've ever said." Daniel laughed quietly. It was the first real laugh Ethan had heard from him. Ethan smiled. "I like that." "What?" "Your laugh." Daniel looked almost embarrassed. "Don't get used to it." Ethan laughed. For a moment, the tension disappeared. They were simply two people sitting beside a fire while a snowstorm surrounded them. But something had changed. Ethan moved slightly closer. Not enough to cross a boundary. Just enough to feel less alone. "Can I ask you one more thing?" Daniel nodded. "If we weren't in this situation, if you weren't my mentor?" He stopped. Daniel waited. "What would you want?" Daniel knew exactly what Ethan was asking. His answer came slowly. I would want to know you. Ethan's heart skipped. You don't already? I know the person you show everyone. Daniel's eyes remained on him. I want to know the person you don't show anyone. Ethan smiled. That's probably the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. Daniel looked away, almost shyly. I'm not very good at romance. Maybe you don't have to be. Their eyes met again. The firelight reflected in Daniel's eyes. For a moment, Ethan imagined what it might feel like to reach across the small distance between them. But he didn't. Neither did Daniel. Instead, Daniel quietly said, when this program ends, things will be different. Ethan understood. You mean the mentorship? Yes. Daniel nodded. Until then, we keep things clear. Ethan smiled. Okay. And after? Daniel hesitated. After, if you still feel the same way? He stopped. Ethan waited. Daniel finally smiled. Then maybe we can have that conversation. Ethan's smile grew. I think I'd like that. The wind slammed against the cabin. The fire flickered. Ethan pulled the blanket around himself. Daniel noticed. Cold. A little. Daniel stood and took another blanket from a nearby shelf. He handed it to Ethan. Their fingers briefly touched. Neither pulled away immediately. It was only a second. But Ethan felt it. So did Daniel. Daniel slowly withdrew his hand. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Daniel. Ethan settled down beside the fire. This time, he fell asleep with a smile. And Daniel remained awake for a few more minutes, watching the flames. For the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow didn't frighten him. Because tomorrow might bring change. And maybe, for once, change could be something beautiful. The storm outside had not ended. But inside the cabin, something much more powerful had begun. Not a rushed romance. Not a secret affair. Something slower. Something honest. Two men had finally admitted that they mattered to each other. And sometimes, the first confession isn't saying, I love you. Sometimes it's simply saying, I want to know you. That night, Ethan and Daniel had said exactly that. The storm ended the next morning. By sunrise, the Rocky Mountains looked completely different. Fresh snow covered the trees, the trails, and the wooden roof of the cabin. The sky had turned bright blue, as if the storm from the night before had never happened. The group packed their belongings and prepared to leave. Ethan stood outside the cabin, looking toward the mountains. He thought about everything Daniel had told him. The fears, the regrets, the quiet confession, and those few words that had stayed in Ethan's mind all night. I want to know you. Ethan wanted to believe those words meant something. But as they began the journey back, Daniel seemed different. More distant. More careful. During the hike, Daniel barely spoke to Ethan. When Ethan asked a question, Daniel answered professionally. When Ethan made a joke, Daniel smiled politely but quickly looked away. At first, Ethan thought Daniel was simply tired. By the time they returned to the lodge, Ethan understood. Daniel was creating distance. And it hurt more than Ethan expected. Over the next few weeks, Daniel became almost impossible to reach. He still treated Ethan fairly. He still gave him instructions. He still helped him during training. But the warmth from the cabin was gone. No more late conversations. No quiet smiles across the room. No small gestures that had once made Ethan feel noticed. Daniel had returned to being the reserved mentor everyone knew. Ethan tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. But every evening he found himself thinking about that cabin. About Daniel sitting beside the fire. About the way he had looked at Ethan when he admitted that Ethan had become important to him. Ethan finally understood something. He wasn't simply interested in Daniel. He had fallen for him. The realization frightened him. But denying it didn't make it disappear. One afternoon, Ethan finally found Daniel alone near the equipment building. Can we talk? Daniel stopped. About what? You. Daniel looked at him. Me. Why are you avoiding me? Daniel was silent. I'm not avoiding you. You are. Ethan stepped closer. You barely talk to me anymore. Daniel sighed. Because I have to do what's right. Ethan's expression softened. I understand the mentor thing. You may understand it now, Daniel said quietly, but I don't want there to be any confusion later. Ethan nodded. So what are you saying? Daniel looked at him for a long moment. I'm saying that what I feel is real. Ethan's heart skipped. But that doesn't mean I have the right to act on it while I'm responsible for your training. Ethan looked down. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel said something Ethan hadn't expected. I'm stepping away. Ethan looked up. What? My role as your mentor. Daniel explained that another instructor would take over Ethan's training for the remainder of the program. I'm not doing this because I don't care. His voice softened. I'm doing it because I do. Ethan felt tears threatening his eyes but managed to smile. Thank you. Daniel nodded. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to do this. I already do. Their eyes met. There was sadness there, but also hope. Daniel smiled. A real smile this time. Take care of yourself, Ethan. You too. Then Daniel walked away. Ethan watched until he disappeared around the corner. It was painful, but somehow, it also felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. 3 months passed. The wilderness program ended. Ethan returned to Denver and began working for an outdoor equipment company while completing additional leadership certifications. Life became busy, but he never forgot Daniel. Sometimes he wondered where Daniel was. Sometimes he wanted to call him, but he remembered their agreement. No relationship while the mentorship existed. So Ethan waited. Then, one rainy Saturday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Ethan walked into a small coffee shop downtown. It was warm and quiet, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and rain-soaked streets. He ordered a coffee and turned around, then stopped. Daniel was sitting near the window. For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. Daniel looked up. Their eyes met. The world seemed to become strangely quiet. Daniel stood. Ethan. Ethan smiled. Hi. Hi. They both laughed nervously. How have you been? Daniel asked. Good. Daniel nodded. Good. Neither knew what to say next. Then Daniel pointed toward the empty chair. Want to sit? Ethan sat down. For the first time, there was no uniform. No training schedule. No mountain program. No professional responsibility separating them. Just Ethan and Daniel. 2 adults sitting across from each other in a coffee shop. Daniel looked different. Less guarded. More relaxed. Ethan smiled. You look happy. Daniel smiled back. I think I am. Why? Daniel looked directly at him. Because I was hoping I'd run into you. Ethan's heart began beating faster. Really? Really? A comfortable silence followed. Then Daniel laughed softly. You still drink your coffee too sweet. Ethan stared at him. You remember? I remember a lot about you. The words made Ethan smile. I remember you never smiled. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I smile. You used to smile once every 3 days. That's exaggerated. Maybe. They both laughed. For the first time, the distance between them felt gone. Daniel reached for his coffee. I've thought about that night many times. So have I. What do you think now? Ethan looked down for a moment. I think I was scared. Of me? No. He looked back at Daniel. Of how much I cared. Daniel's expression softened. I was scared too. Are you still? Daniel thought about it. A little. Ethan smiled. Me too. Daniel slowly reached across the table. He didn't grab Ethan's hand. He simply placed his hand on the table between them. An invitation. Nothing more. Ethan looked at it. Then gently placed his hand beside Daniel's. Their fingers touched. Neither moved away. Daniel smiled. So. Would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Ethan's smile grew. I'd like that. Outside, rain continued falling over Denver. Inside the little coffee shop, something that had begun in a mountain cabin was finally being given a chance to grow. Not as mentor and student. Not as 2 people bound by rules. But simply as Ethan and Daniel. 2 men. 2 hearts. And perhaps, finally, a chance at love. The first date was followed by another. Then another. And slowly, without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, Ethan and Daniel became part of each other's everyday lives. There was no rush, no dramatic promises, no attempt to turn their story into something it wasn't. They simply learned each other. Ethan learned that Daniel liked his coffee black, hated crowded restaurants, and always checked the weather before leaving the house. Daniel learned that Ethan talked when he was nervous, laughed at his own jokes, and had a habit of leaving books everywhere. They became friends before they became anything else. And somewhere between morning coffee, long walks through Denver, and quiet conversations late at night, their friendship became something deeper. One evening, while they were sitting together on Ethan's apartment balcony, Ethan looked at Daniel. "Do you ever think about that night?" Daniel knew exactly which night he meant. "The cabin?" Ethan nodded. "All the time." Daniel looked toward the city lights. "So do I." Ethan smiled. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the storm hadn't come." Daniel thought about it. Maybe we wouldn't have talked. Maybe we would have taken another year to say what we felt. Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds like you." Daniel smiled. Then his expression became serious. "That night changed me." Ethan looked at him. "How?" Daniel took a breath. "I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life protecting myself from love." Ethan reached for his hand. Daniel looked down at their fingers. Then he held Ethan's hand. "I was afraid," Daniel admitted. "I know. I thought if I never let anyone close again, I'd never have to lose anyone." Ethan squeezed his hand. "But you would have been alone." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." They sat quietly for a while. Then Daniel looked at Ethan. "And then you came along." Ethan smiled. "I'm glad I did." "So am I." Several months later, Ethan suggested they return to the mountains. "The cabin?" Daniel asked. "The cabin." Daniel smiled. "You sure?" "Absolutely." They drove into the Rocky Mountains on a cold autumn morning. By evening, they reached the familiar cabin. It looked smaller than Ethan remembered. Maybe because he was no longer the same person who had entered it during the snowstorm months before. Daniel opened the door. Ethan stepped inside. The fireplace was still there. The wooden walls still carried the same quiet warmth. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan laughed. "What?" Daniel asked. "I remember sitting right there." He pointed toward the fireplace. "That night, I thought you were the most intimidating person I'd ever met." Daniel smiled. "And now?" Ethan looked at him. "Now you're still intimidating." Daniel laughed. Ethan smiled. "But you're also the safest person I know." Daniel's smile slowly disappeared. His expression became emotional. He stepped closer. "Ethan, I'm serious." Daniel nodded. "I know." They stood near the fireplace. No storm surrounded them this time. No fear. No professional boundaries. No uncertainty. Just the quiet cabin and the two men who had found their way back to it. That night, they talked until late. They remembered the first conversation they had shared. The first time Daniel had smiled. The first time Ethan realized that Daniel cared. The night of the storm. The difficult months afterward. And the coffee shop where everything had finally changed. Eventually, they went to sleep. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. He quietly stepped outside. Daniel followed a few minutes later. The sky was beginning to change. Dark blue slowly became purple. Purple became pink. And then golden sunlight appeared over the Rocky Mountains. Ethan stood beside Daniel, watching the sunrise. "It's beautiful." Daniel nodded. "Yeah." After a moment, Daniel spoke. "I used to come here alone." Ethan looked at him. "How many times?" "Too many." Daniel smiled faintly. "I thought being alone was peaceful." "And now?" Daniel looked at Ethan. "Now I think peace is having someone beside you who understands your silence." Ethan's eyes softened. Daniel took his hand. "For the first time in years," he said quietly, "I'm not afraid of being loved." Ethan smiled. "You don't have to be." Daniel squeezed his hand. "I know." They stood together as sunlight spread across the mountains. The cold morning air surrounded them. But Ethan didn't feel cold. He felt home. Later, they walked down the snowy trail together. Their footprints appeared side by side in the fresh snow. Ethan looked at them. Funny. What? We started with one person walking ahead and the other trying to keep up. Daniel smiled. And now? Ethan looked at their hands. Now we're walking together. Daniel stopped. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he smiled. A genuine, peaceful smile. The same smile Ethan had first seen beside the fireplace months ago. Only this time, there was no fear behind it. They continued walking through the snow. The mountains stood quietly around them. And Ethan realized that the storm had never really been the beginning of their story. It had simply opened a door. A door that led them from fear to honesty. From loneliness to friendship. From friendship to love. The mountain night hadn't ended their story. It had only given them the courage to begin it. And as Ethan and Daniel disappeared together along the snowy trail, neither of them looked back. They didn't need to. The past had taught them enough. The future was waiting ahead. Together,